back to what is part 4 of our study through the church's history of the 20th century. And tonight we're going to study one of the most impactful men of all of the 20th century, a man who was instilled to the highest places of leadership, but a man who maybe nobody expected a whole lot from. It's going to be a fascinating and maybe an unusual story to you. This is a man that few of us know much about his life. At least I'm sure that few of us listening to this today know much about his life. But this is a man who impacts the life of over 1 billion people in the world nearly every day, at least every time that they come to church. He was born on November the 25th, 1881, as one of 13 children born to poor farmers, and yet he would sit in power as one of, if not the most powerful man in the world during his life. And yet he was there kind of as a placeholder just to see what would be next. His name was Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli, but history knows him as Pope John the 23rd. Now, as convinced Baptists who are eager to study the history of the church, at least I hope you're eager to study the history of the church, we might think a journey into Roman Catholicism is going to be kind of an unnecessary detour. Like most of us would believe that the Roman Catholic Church is no longer, and maybe never even was, a true expression of faithful Christianity. So why in the world would we study the life of a pope? What could we possibly learn that would benefit us from the life of a pope? The Bishop of Rome has no authority here. Why would we study Catholicism? Well, let me give you a couple of reasons why I think this is important for us. First is we live in a world where Catholicism is in the news all the time. We constantly hear stories about Pope Francis or Catholic controversies, and many times we don't have the capacity to understand those stories because we are so disconnected from Catholic thinking and from Catholic life. But this is the world we live in, and it would serve us well to understand it. Second, I believe that the sheer size of the Roman Church compels us to reckon with it as we think about church history. You see, there are something like 1.2 billion Catholics in the world today. And if we use the term Christian, or if we use the term church in its broadest possible sense, understand its broadest possible sense, then the largest expression of what is called Christianity, quote unquote, on planet Earth is Roman Catholicism. Think of it this way. If the entire population of planet Earth was reduced to 100 people, and those 100 people were kind of symbolic of all the people of the world, and all those 100 people lived on an island somewhere, of those 100 people, you would have 29 Christians on your island. 29 Christians, or at least 29 people would tell you they were Christians. You would have 24 Muslims, 14 Hindus, 6 Buddhists, and fascinatingly, you would only have part of 1 Jew. But of those 29 people on our island who would tell you that they were Christians, 15 of them would be Roman Catholics. Third, I think we need to know as much as possible where our doctrinal convictions differ from Roman Catholicism. As a Baptist pastor, I have been told over and over and over again that one of the problems in churches like ours is that we don't know what we believe or why we believe it. I've been told that's the problem that many Christians have in their daily walk. They don't know what they believe or why they believe it. Well, I think that part of knowing what we believe and why we believe it is knowing what we don't believe and why we don't believe it. Now, it's outside of the scope of this class time to deal with every theological distinction of Roman Catholicism and every difference between what we believe and what Roman Catholicism teaches. But ask yourself this question. Knowing that throughout history, most people who have claimed to be Christian have been affiliated with the church at Rome, ask yourself this question. Why are you not a Roman Catholic? Your answer to that question demands a lot of theology, but it also demands a little bit of church history. So we're going to look tonight at the story of Catholicism quickly in the changing world of the 20th century. And this is Roman Catholicism as it struggles to remain significant and faithful to its understanding of the church that is still today, in many respects, on an uneasy footing in the modern world. Now, the place to start in our story is in Italy in 1922. Giuseppe, who will go on to become Pope John the 23rd, he's already in his early 40s. He entered the Franciscan order in 1897, and he had been ordained to the priesthood in 1904. And now he is Father Angelo Roncalli. He's secretary to the Bishop of Bergamo. He had been drafted in World War I. He had served as a medic and a chaplain in the Italian army. And he was something of a rising star in the Catholic Church. He always seemed to gravitate toward these influential positions where he would regularly hobnob with the Pope. In fact, he had been appointed by Pope Benedict XV to become part of an important Catholic missions agency. And he was on record as saying that Pope Benedict XV was the favorite Pope that he had met. But his beloved Pope died unexpectedly of pneumonia in 1922, and that's an inconvenient problem for Roman Catholics, that the head of their church just keeps dying. So as it happened, hundreds of times throughout the centuries, the College of Cardinals met in Rome to elect a new pope. And during the conclave of 1922, the cardinals were sharply divided, just as many parts of Christianity were divided in the 1920s. Catholicism was divided too, between those who were theologically conservative and those who felt the need to modernize and to bring the church along into the modern world. And so after 14 different voting periods, the white smoke appears over St. Peter's, and those important words were announced to the faithful: Habemus Papam, we have a pope. And the new pope would take the name of Pius XI. And Pius XI's papacy was significant because it just so happens that also in 1922, in Italy, a young revolutionary journalist turned politician named Benito Mussolini became the prime minister of Italy. And just by saying the name Mussolini, you know that this pope is going to have his hands full as he leads the Roman Church through the challenges of the modern world, as he deals with fascism and totalitarianism. And even today, we think of those familiar news stories where Pope Francis is commenting on everything from Islamic terrorism to mass migration to poverty and environmentalism and on and on and on. And so the days of the Pope dealing with the occasional renegade king or out-of-control Lutheran are over. This is a new era for the church as they're wrestling with the complexity of a new world. And just to put this in a little bit of a geographical perspective, Benito Mussolini and Pope Pius XI, they lived and worked less than a mile away from each other. But at first, everything in their relationship seemed to go really, really well. Mussolini's vision for Italy was that of a revived Roman Empire. And he believed that a strong sense of Roman Catholic identity was essential to developing a strong Italian unity. So he mandated Catholicism be taught in public schools. He banned Protestant worship, even from people's homes, and no pope is ever going to argue with that. And so both Pius and Mussolini, they viewed parliamentary democracy as impeding their goals. The Church of Italy was so supportive of Benito Mussolini that when Mussolini called for Italians to melt down their gold wedding bands and to sell that gold to donate towards war efforts that he was advancing, Catholic priests in Italy actually melted down the crucifixes that they wore and sold those to fund the war efforts. And that relationship, that close relationship, would lead to some negotiations that would eventually produce what was called the Lateran Accords of 1929, that effectively recognized the Roman Catholic Church as the state church of Italy, but also established Vatican City as its own separate and sovereign nation. So understand that the head of the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, is not just the head of their church, but he's actually the head of a government. He is the head of state for Vatican City. And the first pope that had that distinction was Pope Pius XI in the 1920s. But towards the end of his reign and towards the end of his life, Pope Pius XI became leery of Mussolini's authoritarianism, and especially Mussolini's relationship with Adolf Hitler. So he drafted a papal encyclical. And a papal encyclical was a letter from the Pope to the whole church where he would denounce racism and he would denounce the persecution of the Jews and make a strong stand against Nazism and fascism. But in one of those weird hiccups of history, Pope Pius XI died after the encyclical was written, but before it would be published. So again, a successor, a new pope is elected. And this pope would take the name of his predecessor. He would be Pope Pius XII. And he became pope on March the 2nd, 1939, almost exactly 6 months before the beginning of World War II. And he never released, for whatever reason, he never released Pope Pius XI's encyclical. And history has not been kind to Pope Pius XII, which, if you're a Baptist watching this, that's probably just fine with you. But he's been nicknamed by historians Hitler's Pope. And that's primarily because of two things. He had been the Vatican's ambassador to Germany before World War II, so he had strong relationships to many people in government in Germany. And many people felt like, the second reason was many people felt like he did not take a strong enough stand with Poland after Germany invaded Poland to begin World War II. And there were many Polish Catholics in particular that were outraged and felt betrayed. But he also, to be fair, he did help save the lives of Jews. He did try and oppose Nazism to the degree that he could, but he was in a difficult place where no matter what he could do, it would never be enough. It would never be enough. And so, even though that characterization of Pope Pius XII as Hitler's Pope is really not fair, he just happened to be Pope when Adolf Hitler was in power. It is certain that after World War II, the church emerges into the modern world produced by World War II on a very, very uneasy footing. You think about the massive changes that happened from, say, 1939 to 1949. There is increasing unrest in the Middle East. There has been the development of the nation-state of Israel in May of 1948. Communism is a major concern on the world stage. We have to remember that the Russians won World War II just like we did. And Pius XII was Pope during the beginning of the Cold War, all of this conflict, and he was Pope for a long time. He was Pope for 19 years. So when he dies, there's a thought process in the Catholic Church among the cardinals who will elect a new Pope from their own number. And we need something different. In fact, if you go back and you study papal history, that's present in almost every papal enclave. There's almost always a very vocal group, whether it's a minority or a majority, that says we need something different in our Pope from what we just had. But because the world was so uncertain and the conclave was somewhat divided, it was decided what the church really needs for a while is just to catch its breath. We need to hit pause. We need a placeholder Pope. We need a stopgap Pope. And enter Cardinal Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli, the farm boy turned priest who had spent the war years of World War II saving Jews from the Germans and had become papal ambassador to liberated France. And by this time, Cardinal Roncalli had no idea that when he went to Rome to elect a new Pope, that he would be the new Pope. It seems that he had no aspirations at all for that office, because in his journal, as he left for the papal conclave, the only thing that he had written about was how bad the body of Pope Pius XII looked after the embalming job kind of didn't turn out very well. In his pocket when he was elected Pope was a return train ticket to Venice. He did not intend to stay in Rome, but he did, sitting on the chair of St. Peter as the Bishop of Rome, as the head of the largest Christian group in the world. But he was in the chair of St. Peter really just to keep it warm until somebody more vibrant would come along. After all, Cardinal Roncalli, the new Pope, was 76 years old. I mean, how much damage is he going to do at 76? But his very first act as Pope is somewhat peculiar, because he took the papal name John, which would make him Pope John the 23rd. Or was it Pope John the 24th? You see, there had already been a Pope John the 23rd. Sort of. In the Middle Ages, 500 years earlier, there had been a man now called an anti-pope who had the name of Pope John the 23rd. At one point during the history of Catholicism, there were three men all claiming to be Pope. And one of those men, who was eventually deemed illegitimate, was a man named Pope John the 23rd. And the first Pope John the 23rd would be arrested for, quote, piracy, rape, sodomy, murder, and incest. That's not a great look for Christianity. So for 500 years since the first Pope John the 23rd, no other Pope had taken the name John. But now this man takes the name John the 23rd. And here's what he says as he's elected Pope and as he takes the papal name John. A lot of self-awareness here. He says, quote, 22 Johns of indisputable legitimacy have been Pope, and almost all had a brief pontificate, end quote. It seems like he understands he's probably not going to be around very long. But he did seem to please the people. He visited prisons and hospitals. He seemed to have the idea that as the Bishop of Rome, he was a pastor to a flock. A lot of times popes throughout history have functioned as bureaucrats or politicians, occasionally theologians or administrators, and very often as kings. But he seemed to view his role as one of service. He visited kids in the hospital with polio, and tellingly, he dropped the use of the papal royal we. Instead of saying, we intend to do this or we have done this, he just said, I am doing this. He went to meet with some young people at their school and gave a speech to them, and he said, I've wanted to come to you for a long time. That is maybe insignificant to us, but at the time in Roman Catholicism, people viewed this as, hey, he's speaking our language. He's acting like one of us and talking directly to us. It seemed that Pope John was descending from the institutional perch of Roman Catholicism to meet with the faithful right where they were. He also had a bit of a sense of humor. John was a big guy, and when he was elected Pope and given his official robes before his first public appearance as Pope, none of the robes that the Vatican had were big enough. And so he made his first appearance as the Pope to the world being held together with bobby pins. Another story is that after becoming Pope, he was walking through Rome, and a faithful Catholic woman saw her Pope in person for the first time, and her first words were, "Oh my God, he's so fat." And he turned and responded to her, "Madam, the Holy Conclave isn't exactly a beauty contest." But here was this poor farmer's son, faithful son of the church, seemed to be a man of the people, but still at 76, I mean, what could happen? But just 3 months after he was elected, Pope John the 23rd did the unthinkable and shocked the world by calling for an ecumenical church council. Now, understand that in the minds of Roman Catholics, this is akin to the Council of Jerusalem that is recorded in Acts chapter number 15. In Catholic thinking, a church council rules infallibly, and the church is bound to what they decide, provided that the decisions and the council is supported by the Pope. And councils had met to discuss the true nature of Christ 1,500 years earlier, all the way up to the Council of Trent, where the Roman Catholic Church responded to the crisis of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. This is a massive decision to call an ecumenical council. But why did he do it? Why did they need an ecumenical council at this time? Well, here are his words. Quote, "We need to open the church and let in some fresh air," end quote. He saw that the church was out of step with the world and that something had to give. Here are his opening words that may shed some light on his thought process. Here are his opening words when the Second Vatican Council met. He said, quote, "What is needed at the present time is a new enthusiasm, a new joy, and a serenity of mind in the unreserved acceptance by all of the entire Christian faith, without forfeiting that accuracy and precision in its presentation which characterized the proceedings of the Council of Trent and the First Vatican Council." Now, listen carefully to those words. He says at the end of that statement that we, or I should say they, need to carry forth the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent was, again, the church council that met in response to the Protestant Reformation, where the Church of Rome officially anathematized those who believe in the authority of Scripture alone. They officially denounced judgment and damnation on those who believe, like I do, in the doctrine of justification by faith alone. And there's good arguments can be made historically that prior to the Council of Trent, the Roman Catholic Church was increasingly corrupt morally and theologically, but it was at Trent that it becomes a true false church. It's at Trent that they truly embrace apostasy. But regardless of that historical position or not, Trent is where the Catholic Church firmly establishes its borders as being opposed to the true gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. He mentions also the First Vatican Council. And it was at the Vatican Council in the late 18th century, or the late 19th century, where very little happened, but they did officially determine to embrace the idea of the infallibility of the Pope. So with that papal infallibility is one of the core Catholic convictions. And so you have this council. Pope John is saying in the Second Vatican Council, in his opening address, he's saying, we are going forward firmly embracing the principles of the Council of Trent and the First Vatican Council, but we're doing that with a new enthusiasm, a new joy, and a new serenity of mind. He says the church needs to be firmly committed to Catholicism, but we also have to realize we're in a different world and we have to adapt. Just an example of how out of place Catholicism seemed to be in the world, the Second Vatican Council that Pope John the 23rd called, it convened in 1962. In November of 1960, America had elected a Roman Catholic president, Senator John F. Kennedy. And before that election, there were many people, particularly Southern Baptists, who were deeply concerned about how a true and faithful Catholic could still support the religious liberty and the ideal of soul freedom enshrined in the Constitution. How can you be committed to Catholicism and still committed to the Constitution that gives us the right to practice whatever religion we feel is best? I mean, would a Catholic not take orders from the Pope? Would a Catholic president not just turn the keys of the kingdom over to the Pope and we become a Roman Catholic nation? So just listen to this sermon by W.A. Criswell in the summer of 1960. And W.A. Criswell is one of the most famous Southern Baptists in history. He says, quote, "The Roman Church wins most of its victories with the weapon of time." Kennedy in Today, with strong emphasis, that he says on the separation of church and state. And the door is open for another Catholic leader who gives the Pope, his ambassador, the church school, state support, and finally, recognition of one church above America. Then religious liberty has also died in America, as it has died in Spain, as it has died in Colombia, as it has died wherever the Roman Catholic hierarchy has the ableness and the power to shut it down and to destroy it in death. End quote. Here's a Baptist pastor in 1960 saying the Roman Catholic Church has no place in power in America. Rome knew about that. They knew about the discomfort of the democratic West, the modernizing West with Roman Catholicism, and they also knew about the communist East and the persecution of Roman Catholics in communist countries. So Rome has a huge image problem, and Vatican II was convened by Pope John the 23rd to correct that. So just listen to the words of Pope Benedict XVI, who was himself present at the Vatican Council. He says, quote, "So we went off to the council not just with joy, but with enthusiasm. There was an incredible sense of expectation. We were hoping that all would be renewed, that there would truly be a new Pentecost, a new era of the church, because the church was still fairly robust at that time. Sunday Mass attendance was still good. Vocations to the priesthood and to religious life were already slightly reduced, but still sufficient. However, there was a feeling that the church was not moving forward, that it was declining, that it seemed more a thing of the past and not the herald of the future. And at that moment, we were hoping that this relation would be renewed, that it would change, that the church might once again be a force for tomorrow and a force for today. And we knew that the relationship between the church and the modern period, right from the outset, had been slightly fraught, beginning with the church's error in the case of Galileo. We were looking to correct this mistaken start and to rediscover the union between the church and the best forces of the world so as to open up humanity's future, to open up true progress. Thus, we were full of hope, full of enthusiasm, and also eager to play our own part in this process." End quote. So there you have a later pope who is still alive today, who was present, who's saying, man, we view this with so much excitement, so much enthusiasm because the church has been wrong since the Renaissance. He's saying we need to adapt to the modern world. And Benedict XVI is himself very, very conservative thinking Catholic. So you can see even in the most conservative branches of Catholicism said, look, we're out of step. We've got to adapt. So unfortunately, Pope John the 23rd did not live to see Vatican II come to completion. A lot of people in the church wondered if his successor, Pope Paul VI, would continue that. A lot of people hoped he wouldn't, but he did. And the impact on the Second Vatican Council on the Church of Rome today is probably impossible to overestimate and really difficult to fully appreciate, because it seems today that there are two schools of thought in Roman Catholicism about Vatican II. On the one hand, there are some who believe that the Second Vatican Council was a strong embrace of Roman Catholicism in the modern world, and that it was about emphasizing doctrinal purity and integrity that was critical to the survival of the Roman Church. Others tend to think that the Second Vatican Council was about Catholicism in the modern world, and it's about modernizing, it's about change, it's about letting go of some of that stuffy doctrine, and have a more vibrant modern church. But typically, when somebody talks about Vatican II or the spirit of Vatican II, it's that ideal that they're embracing. They're embracing modernity, and they're embracing change in the Roman Catholic Church. So I'll just report a few key decisions that came out of the Council of Trent, and I will let the Roman Catholics fight about exactly what they mean, because it's not my monkey, it's not my circus. The first significant shift in the Council of Vatican II came from a renewed emphasis on the idea, directed to rank and file Catholics, hey, this is your church. It was communicated from Vatican II. You belong to the mission of God, just like your priest does, just like your bishops do, just like the cardinals do. And this was significant because for a long time, the perception had been that the church was the hierarchical institution ruled over by those who had taken their sacred vows. But ordinary people weren't part of the church. They went to church to take Mass, but they didn't participate in the work of the church. The priest did that at the altar. Your work is to go to Mass and to support with your giving. And this was actually a key argument in the Protestant Reformation, that everybody's work was God's work, that there wasn't a sacred and a secular distinction. Second shift in Vatican II was that they intentionally included faith leaders who were Christian but who were not Catholic. There were Greek Orthodox observers present. And the message of Vatican II seemed to be, hey, we want you to come back home. Of course, the Roman Catholic Church believes they are the true church, but they wanted to be extending an olive branch saying, you're welcome to come and be with us. And for many people, the perception of Roman Catholicism was that, they're just one step away from a second Inquisition. They're ready to burn people at the stake. But the tone toward outsiders had softened and has softened. A few years ago, as an example of this, a few years ago at a meeting with Lutheran and Catholic high school students, a Lutheran student asked Pope Francis what he liked about Lutheran churches and what he disliked. And here's his quote. It's a good quote. He said, I like Lutherans who follow the true faith of Jesus, but I dislike lukewarm Catholics. It's very telling, isn't it? That it's not so much about the denominational preferences or the denominational lines, but it's about the individual's experience of walking with Jesus. And related to that was the official position of Vatican II for the first time in the long history of the Catholic Church that said the best forms of human government respect the rights of individuals to worship however they see fit. That is a far cry from churches and popes demanding that governments bow to the authority of the papacy. And perhaps the most noticeable immediate change that came from Vatican II, at least for an ordinary Catholic, was that for the first time in the entire history of the Roman Church, the Sunday Mass was now allowed to be performed in the common language of the people. So consider this. Catholics, for hundreds of years, heard the Mass performed in Latin, which had been the official language of Rome all those centuries ago. And so you'd go to church, and whether you were a German-speaking Catholic in the 1400s or whether you were an English-speaking Catholic in the 1940s, you would go to church and you would hear the priest say Mass in this mysterious language of the church. And then after Vatican II, the next Sunday maybe, you go to church and you hear it in English for the very first time. And they heard the words of the Mass in the language that they spoke every day. And for the most part, they hated it. There's a story from the life of J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and all that he was a faithful Catholic. And when he would go to church, and after Vatican II, the priest would be reciting the words in English, Tolkien would very loudly say the words in Latin. He was not happy with these changes. The church seemed to lose some of its mystery in this change. But for these changes, Vatican II was still a profoundly Catholic moment. As I mentioned, it was Pope John the 23rd's intention that the Second Vatican Council stand on the shoulders of Trent while bowing to the papal authority from Vatican I. So consider these words from Pope Benedict XVI. He says this: the Paschal mystery as the center of what it is to be Christian, and therefore the Christian life, the Christian year, and the Christian seasons. He says, in that quote, he says, this is what Vatican II was about. The Paschal mystery at the center of what it means to be a Christian and to live a Christian life. And on the surface, the phrase Paschal mystery seems to be talking about a cross-centered life. But the language of Vatican II explains this as referring to the liturgy of the Mass. That it is by attending Mass and observing the liturgy of Roman Catholic worship where really the death of Christ is made complete and our relationship to Him is made complete. In a similar way, the Second Vatican Council is deeply Catholic in its veneration for the Virgin Mary, saying this, quote, by her obedience, faith, and burning charity in the work of the Savior in giving back supernatural life to souls, Mary has become our mother in the order of grace. End quote. Our mother in the order of grace. Roman Catholics in Vatican II even went so far as to call Mary our co-mediatrix. The Catholic Church will tell you that Christ is the only mediator between God and man, which is what the Bible says. but that Mary, through her faith and her obedience to God to bring Jesus into the world through his birth, becomes part of his work, and she is herself interceding for the church right now in heaven. So Vatican II was attempting to modernize the church, but it was still Roman Catholicism. So it is, I think, that today, for better or worse, whether the church seems too Catholic for some or too modern for others, the church of today is shaped by Vatican II. Every Catholic you could possibly read will tell you that Pope Francis is the living embodiment of the ideas of the Second Vatican Council. And I think that understanding that helps explain what can appear to be sometimes his inconsistent position as the head of the Roman Catholic Church, who has to enforce and live in the dogmas of Roman Catholicism, who lives under canon law, and yet who still seems to contradict Catholic teaching by seemingly embracing homosexuality and socially liberal positions. And it seems that today the question for many Catholics is the Pope Catholic? John the 23rd, who called Vatican II, was not an evangelical. Certainly not a Baptist. He did not believe in the gospel of salvation by faith in Jesus alone, but his influence is staggering. The world is being shaped by his decision to attempt to orient the Church of Rome to the modern world. To consider just how staggering the Second Vatican Council is, think about this. There were at the Second Vatican Council 4 men who would become Pope. There were 8 people at the Second Vatican Council who would become or will likely become saints. This is a big deal. It's a big deal. But what can I, as a Baptist, what can you, maybe as a non-Catholic, what can you learn from the life of Pope John the 23rd? First, I think you should be aware that the problems in Catholicism today are Catholic problems. The challenges of Rome to adapt to the modern world are fiercely Catholic problems, and in many ways are unique to Catholicism. For instance, when it comes to their ecumenicism and their embrace of non-Catholic Christians, what can the church do? What can the church do when it is still bound by the Council of Trent and will be bound by the Council of Trent? The problem of predator priests is a uniquely Catholic problem. It's not to say that it's not in other denominations, even in our own denominations where pastors and church leaders prey on children. But understand this is a uniquely Catholic dilemma in Roman Catholicism because there is a theological roadblock that is in place. And that is that they believe that once a man is ordained to the priesthood, that is a lifetime ordination. And it's not just that he stands up and preaches every week, but that he literally has the power to call Jesus from heaven, to call him in the words of the Mass, to call him to become this bread, to become this wine, and offer a sacrifice for people's sins. They believe that once he has taken his sacred vows, he has that power for life. What do you do with a man who has that power, but who also is convicted of terrible crimes against children? That's a Catholic problem. And from that, we should extrapolate today that truth matters. Doctrine matters. We should not only know what we believe and why we believe it, but we should understand how the things that we believe shape our view of the world and our handling of the world's challenges. Second, I think we should learn from the life of Pope John the 23rd that there's a certain flow to the history of the church. What I mean is that if you trace the pattern of who becomes Pope when and why and how, you will notice that the church is almost always acting like the pendulum in a grandfather clock. It's always swinging from one direction to the next, responding to what came before. And that's how a lot of church history functions. Right now, Pope Francis is certainly not a conservative pope, but the pope before him, Pope Benedict XVI, was. And Pope John the 23rd himself was a reaction to the lengthy papacy of Pius XII. And that's how church history works. It swings back and forth. Church history is a series of overreactions. It is one error being taught, being accepted, being perceived, and being overreacted against until it becomes another error that is taught and then perceived and then so on and so forth. The errors of today become the opposite errors of tomorrow. But third, I think we should learn from the life of John the 23rd because I think we should learn, rather, that this is our mission field. I began by saying that there are today over 1 billion Catholics in the world. And if we want to share the gospel with them, then that means understanding what they believe and how Scripture challenges it, and how Jesus offers them salvation through his work alone. If the mission is the world, then there are vast numbers of people in our mission field that are Roman Catholics. And few of them, in my experience at least, seem to fully understand their own theological beliefs. And this is one of the challenges of Roman Catholicism. And I think they would admit this is a challenge, that it's the priest who needs to know what you believe. It's the church that they know what they believe. And the church believes what I believe, and I believe what the church teaches. And it doesn't matter day to day if I have a real firm grasp on doctrine. And so there's ignorance many places, many times, of Roman Catholicism, especially as Roman Catholicism in many countries has a long history of adapting and embracing local folk religion and becoming this own unique hybrid in South America or in Africa or in Asia and other places. But you have Roman Catholics who aren't sure what they believe, and they need to be brought to the point where they understand the inconsistency of what they believe when laid alongside the truth of the Word of God, so that they can be pointed to the true gospel, so that they can be welcomed to Jesus. And we need to be equipped to do that in a helpful and an informed way. In a helpful and an informed way. On our island of 100 people, there are 15 of them that are Roman Catholics. 15% of our world's population, thereabouts, is in some way connected to the Church at Rome. And it is the largest single section, the largest single block of our mission field. And we have to be able to engage them well for the glory of God. And we can do that, I think, by learning from Roman Catholic history, learning what they believe, why they believe it, and learning from that what we believe and why we believe it.